Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we're going to get started here in just a moment. If you can find your seat, find your sandwich and cookie, and settle in for an hour of a really stimulating discussion. I'm very pleased to have a special guest here that I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, I want to say welcome to the Citrus Research Exchange. As you probably know, this is a lecture series that happens every Wednesday, usually upstairs in the auditorium, so thank you for being flexible and accommodating us down here. There's another big event up there. I want to welcome not only you who are with us here in the room, but also our remote viewers. We webcast these events live every week to our partner campuses at Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz, and then make it available on our YouTube channel. And Paul was just telling me that he had notice from a friend in Florida who is going to be tuning in to the conversation today. So we're really pleased to welcome all of the remote viewers as well. Because this format is a little bit different today, it's going to be not just a stand and present slides followed by Q&A, but more of a discussion, more of a fireside chat kind of format. We welcome your questions as well. So if you want to just write them down on a little piece of paper, my colleague Brandy Noneke can pick them up, and we'll try to intersperse them along in the conversation. So if you have things that you're burning to ask, feel free. Oh, we have little cards as well. In case you only have electronic devices and no old technology of pen and paper. So thanks again for coming, and I'm pleased to welcome Paul Duan from Bayes Impact. Bayes Impact was launched in 2014 to bring together full-time data scientists, engineers, and academics who believe data science can be used to solve the world's most ambitious problems. Bayes Impact has assisted in enabling microfinance within developing countries, tracking criminal activity in Seattle, and identifying money laundering schemes through network analysis. So those are just a few little teasers that I'm sure Paul will talk a little bit more about. Paul specializes in fraud detection, people analytics, and terrible puns, which I'm looking forward to.
I learned there was a webcast, so I'm going to avoid that. No,
setting up high expectations. He was formerly a data scientist at Eventbrite, and previous work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Healthcare Data Consortium, among other publications. So welcome, Paul. Really pleased to have you here. And I should say welcome back. You're a Berkeley alum.
Yep.
So we're pleased to have you here. Why don't we start out by having you just tell us a little bit about Bayes Impact and what you do, what the organization is all about.
Sure. So Bayes Impact is about using data science to solve social problems. So having said that, it's pretty vague. And that's also, by the way, why I'm kind of looking forward to this fireside chat format, because our process was very iterative. We started with an idea, and then the past year and a half has been mostly about trying to figure out how exactly we would execute on the idea. Big data, super fluffy word, doesn't mean anything. Social good is probably as fluffy as big data. And so the big question for us was, how do we do something that actually works, and how do we execute on it? So I think it makes sense that we have more of an interactive format, and looking forward to that. So what we do right now, we build technology solutions to social problems that we then give to governments. So the main idea here is that algorithms are a tremendous source of leverage. You take the example of Netflix. Small team of data scientists change the algorithms. It can affect the way 300 million people watch movies. Right? That's a huge amount of leverage for, no offense, but kind of a trivial problem. But it is a huge amount of impact that single individuals can have through algorithms. And the question that we ask ourselves is it possible to use the same kind of leverage for social problems, right? Or when we talk about marketing campaigns or ad optimization, any kind of technique that can improve the lift of a campaign by 5%, that's great, but can we improve the efficiency of a social program by 5%? Because 5% times the number of beneficiaries of a social program equals tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even more lives that you actually touch in a significant way. So that was the main impetus for what we do. And today, our biggest project is working with the French government on revamping their unemployment service. So they have one big program for unemployment service that does counseling for the unemployed and help them find jobs. It's been shown to be fairly effective. So they improve the probability of finding a job within 3 months by more than 50% in some cases. And it's also a mandatory program that enrolls 5 million people a year, find jobs for about 2.5 million people. Obviously, a very important institution, and our work is in trying to solve its main problem, which is that the programs are not scalable, and it's very difficult for them to offer that service to all the unemployed in France, and also that the advice they give might also be improved with better knowledge of the labor market in real time. So our work is in building an application that actually helps digitize it, some kind of a super advisor that is self-service, just software-based, and that will help solve that issue. So that's the concept that we do.
Good. Well, it sounds like some of your clients are the government agencies who are using your services. Are there talk a little bit more about your relationship and how you work with the organizations that you're seeking to serve.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the bio, we worked with a variety of institutions, including small nonprofits, and we work with the Zilisha, another Combinator-backed nonprofit that does microfinance, and we help them with fraud detection, reducing the cost of their loans. So there's kind of a huge range of organizations we've been working with between nonprofits and governments. The overarching idea here is that the difficult part about technology, about implementing technology to solve these problems, is not the technology itself, it's the organizational change. Right? It's nice to have an algorithm that can predict X, Y, or Z, but then if it's not integrated within, for example, the underwriting flow of the microfinance institution, it's not really useful. When it comes to governments, same thing. The solution that you build has to have some kind of operational impact. That means that it has to actually change the way that people operate, and that's very, very difficult, especially in governments. The way that we started, so that's one of the main reasons why Base Impact right now is not a distributed organization with a lot of volunteers with cells around the world. The way that we operate is more of a centralized group here in San Francisco with a full-time team. And I guess the main thing we realized is that what was really difficult was organizational change, and as a result, we needed to focus. And so we only work with a few organizations at a time.
And so how big is the team that you work with at Base Impact?
We're 8 people right now. It's a mixture of data scientists, engineers, designers, people on the business side.
And what are some of the other global challenges that you're looking at? You mentioned working in France and unemployment, working in microfinance. Are there other sectors that you're working in?
So a big thing I'm looking at right now is actually trying to figure out if there's anything we can do for the refugee crisis in Europe and in the Middle East. I'll share with you the current state of the conversation, but and also obviously it's something that is bound to change with the recent events. But it seemed to us like the main issue with the refugee crisis was that the countries are just not prepared from an administrative standpoint to receive such an influx of people, and that has also tragic consequences for the refugees themselves, who often could have access to a bunch of services, be it government social services or services provided by the community. There's a bunch of Airbnb for refugees that popped up, but it's extremely hard to coordinate. And I think in this case, it's actually almost a case of I won't say government failure, but what happens essentially is that you have these refugees who come in and they don't have a government, right? And while they're stuck in the administrative limbo, they don't have access to government services. And so one of the things we were looking at was, can we recreate an environment for them?
So are you working with agencies? I know the refugee crisis has a number of players that are trying to attack it, but things like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and other organizations, NGOs like that, are you working with them as intermediaries to try to create solutions?
Yeah, I think a big problem is the lack of coordination between all the different actors. Right. As you may know, the HCR, for example, has an ambiguous relationship with the governments. In some cases, they act as a watchdog. They rely on them for some of the administrative processes, but they also do not fully trust them. With reason. It's important to be somewhat independent. And then you have all the actors of the civil society. I mentioned the Airbnb for refugees type initiatives. And it's kind of difficult to bring them all together. And then when I said governments, obviously governments is one single entity. You have a lot of cooperation issues throughout Europe between countries like the Balkans, where people get processed, which is the main entry point, their destination country. So that's for myself, it's a pretty big clusterfuck that we need to bring all the two.
So thinking about it from a data science perspective, what are the data sources that you're working with, and what are the challenges in working across so many agencies and such with the kind of data that you're working with?
I'll take the example of the unemployment project. So here, the data sources that we need are essentially all the data sources about the labor market. The government themselves hold pretty good records. They have statistical surveys. They have a bunch of information that is pretty accurate. Not very real time, but it's there. So you have kind of like that type of survey, which are the super exhaustive, expensive ones that are done once a year. You have private job boards, so the places where companies actually upload their job posts, which is kind of the opposite. It's a real-time flow. It's not exhaustive. You have the data that is gathered by the career advisors, so both private and public. So the French Unemployment Agency has some of these programs. Some HR companies also have some of these programs, and all of them have data that provide insights on what works and what doesn't work when it comes to helping people find jobs. So you have very different sources of data, and the big difficulty is in bringing them all together. So not only from a technical standpoint, because you have data from multiple sources, from that are updated at on different time frames, that respond to different standards. I mean, just for example, the 50,000 ways of describing the same job, right? So if you say analyst, it could be literally anything. So you have the technical issues like this, but then you also have more, organizational type issues where you want to gather data from organizations that might have competing interests. So when it comes to private companies, some of them are competitors. There's an ambiguous relationship between private and public companies. And so one of the big pieces of our model is that we are a nonprofit, which helps us bring all these same players around the table. And because we're a decentralized organization, we also can guarantee that that the data is not going to be just out there, right? It's so it's kind of like a difficult dance to manage, but that's broadly how we do it.
So you mentioned that Bayes Impact is a nonprofit. I wondered if you could talk us through a little bit your decision process in incorporating as a nonprofit rather than a for-profit organization.
Oh, that's a tough question.
Good.
And it's funny because Bayes Impact went through, I guess, different stages, and I'll probably talk about that later. But the way that we operate has changed over time, and so the reason for why we're nonprofit actually also changed over time. But right now, the main thing is that being a nonprofit is very important for our vision, because getting all these players to act together requires some kind of impartial entity that's also independent. So that's the main way that we can bring everyone around the same table, and we can get, if you want to get LinkedIn and Viadeo to share the data, so they're both competitors, is very difficult to do if you're a for-profit. And I think another broader point, just on a more philosophical standpoint, is that what we're trying to do is to do impact at scale and change the way that these social institutions run. And so essentially, it's a vision for how society should be, right? So society should be open, transparent, fair, efficient, and we believe it's very important that this vision is carried out by an entity that doesn't have conflicts of interest, right? And just in general, I mean, a lot of these problems can be solved. Something I'd like to say is that the role of governments is to step in the case of market failures, right? The problem is what happens in the case of government failures. Well, that's when I believe that nonprofits should step up, because the issue here is that a lot of problems subsist because you have, not because you have a lack of talent, not because you have a lack of money. For example, the US government has plenty of both. The main issue is that you have a lot of conflicts of interest, you have misaligned financial incentives, and so one thing that we realize is that the main way to move things forward when the situation is blocked because of misaligned financial incentives is to give up our financial incentives.
So we talked about some of the challenges of the data that you're working with. What are the opportunities or the promising developments on the horizon that are going to make your job easier or more efficient or have more impact?
Oh, I think the main thing right now about the whole data for good community, especially when it comes to development, is that we are still very focused on program evaluation and not so much on how we can actually change these programs using data. So we are still a bit more on the insights phase rather than on the operational phase. I think the main change that will happen over the next few years is when these organizations know how to better harness these technologies, when we have new players, startups that come in and help streamline a bunch of processes like data collection. We will be able to shift the debate away from just analyzing the impact of existing programs and just trying to create the best programs that we can with the current technology.
And are there organizations now that you would point to that are doing a good job of this?
In the tech for good space in general, or data
or
for good
in
specifically?
data for good, yeah.
So it's a very fragmented space where you have a bunch of key players that all try to tackle the problem from different angles, and I think all of them are important, right? So you have some folks, the Data Pop Alliance in New York City, that work more on capacity building. So they educate government leaders around the world on best data practices and how to understand these issues. You have DataKind also in New York that has a distributed network of volunteers and also now fellows that do really good work at helping nonprofits harness the data they have and so kind of act as data science consultants. I mean, you have obviously all the folks at CFA, Code for America, that even though they're not specifically data focused, you have all the organizations that work in the open data movement in a broader sense, which also provide access points for people like us that want to build applications. So it's a very interesting space. Our take on this is that the main gap we're trying to fill is on the product development side and building these operational solutions, but then you have this whole ecosystem around it where you have to also educate the people on data. You have to collect the data. Medic Mobile is doing some great work at it in the health space. So all the whole mobile health movement, for example, is huge because that allows data collection when there is no infrastructure to do so through conventional means, right? Especially in developing countries. So data collection, data awareness. On the data science side with DataKind, you have open data. So you have a bunch of things. It's a very interesting space.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Just one question as you're looking at all these data sources and working with vulnerable populations, what kind of concerns or protections do you have in place for the privacy and security of those people?
Yeah, that's a huge thing because the big dilemma, right, in the whole data for good space is that the more granular your data, the more useful it is, but also the more anonymized it is and the more useless it is. And so you always have to strike a complicated balance between the two. For us, the main safeguard is that what we are doing is open source. So there's transparency on the algorithms. People know how we're using the data, what we're using it for. That's one big thing. For example, there was I read this article this morning on people talking about the Facebook flag feature, where you can overlay your profile picture with the flag of France, and probably should be other countries, but right now it's only France. And so, by the way, I think that we pay way too much attention to that Facebook flag issue. But there was this one argument that I found interesting, which was, if you wanted to, you could actually use this data for a lot of interesting things. For example, if you wanted to pinpoint leaders of opinion, you could look at whose profile picture change triggered other people's profile picture change, right?
Yeah.
And that's important because changing your picture to have the French flag on it also reflects your political views, right? So it's something that would be really interesting to know. I personally don't think Facebook is doing this, but because it's not open source, because you don't know whether they're doing it or not, you can't always clear up the issue, right? So I think for us, being open source is very important. And then, as I said, the whole idea of having a permanent organization where we can actually provide safety guarantees around the data. It's not the data that we ship around the world with volunteers. As we sign NDAs. We have processes in place that we get sued through the ass if we if we lose the data. That's also very important. And then, and I guess more on the ethical side, I think being a nonprofit and being independent helps a lot. For example, that helps us choose which type of work we want to get and which type of work we don't want to get. For example, we don't do any kind of surveillance because we personally don't think that this is something that we want to do, and we're totally free to do it. I guess right now the safeguard of our ethical values is us. At some point, as we grow, it makes sense to have an ethical committee, an ethics committee, but right now it's us, and then it's safeguarded by the fact that we're open source, and so we make our decisions in the open.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Y Combinator, you went through this prestigious and very selective program. I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, the process that you went through there, and just sort of your thinking as a young company, and how that sort of entrepreneurial training helped you to come to where you are now.
Y Combinator is super interesting. So back when we went there, we were we're the only nonprofit in our batch. There have been some before us. There was WotC, there was Elisha. So we were the only one in our batch, which means that there was no specific nonprofit program. It was basically just us, thrown in the cage with other for-profits. I later learned that there was not that much difference between us and for-profits. So we're the only nonprofit, but everyone else was a no-profit. I think the main thing that YC brought us was a growth mindset and the idea that we can be ambitious, we can take risks. A big issue in the whole nonprofit space is that you have this huge gap. You have these. I think the stat is that the numbers may not be exactly right, but the order of magnitude is right. The average age of creation, the average date of creation of nonprofits with more than $25 million a year budget is 1906 or something like this, right? So it's kind of this situation where you have a big chasm between a lot of local nonprofits and a few really big ones, United Way, the Red Cross, and you have pretty much nothing in the middle. Simply because you have no growth capital, it's very hard to get any kind of funds to spearhead your growth, and especially in terms of investment in the future. And the idea that we should approach it more as a startup, I think, was very important in the way that we operate. And I also don't want to minimize the importance of risk taking. I think that's very important. That's the type of thinking that that is not standard right now, in the whole nonprofit space. And when you apply for grants, it actually looks less an investment and more like an expense report that you do before the fact, right? You have to write your 5-year budget, and I mean, a lot of you have written grants for academic projects, right? So you know how it is. That is difficult because, as a young organization, we're bound to change, right? As we learn, we're going to pivot. We're going to encounter difficulties. We're going to encounter opportunities, and simply put, we could not have grown the way we have if we had to decide on a model from day one. We kind of start with the first principles. We start with the hypothesis that we set out to test. And the whole YC approach of it's no strings attached, we give you some money because we believe in the team, we believe in the ideas, and then it's up to you to figure out how to improve it over time. I think there was a boon for us.
Great. So is there particular advice you would offer to young entrepreneurs here who have an idea about what they want to do to bring their skills to change the world, whether that's in a for-profit or nonprofit model?
So, okay, main piece of advice, don't get student debt. It sounds dumb, but the one thing that really helped us stay afloat when we started, we were bootstrapped. So when I started Base Impact, I had 2 years of experience, right? So I had saved for 2 years. So I had some amount of money, but not that much. We didn't get a massive grant from a celebrity. We didn't get millions of dollars to start. And that kind of, I was talking about risk taking, right? Like taking that risk would be probably impossible if I also had financial commitments on the side. And so having that financial freedom is something that is super, super important. And I actually would advise against going the nonprofit route if you do have a lot of student debt or if you have things to repay, because you will always be stressed out about how to make ends meet. You won't be able to take big risks. When we decided to go for this French project, we're like, yeah, we're jumping straight from working with small nonprofits to let's work with the government of a first world country and revamp one of the major social institutions. That kind of risk taking is only possible because for us it was like, even if we fail, it's not too big a deal. I would have foregone maybe a year of salary. It's not too bad. Still young. If I get a job now, I can still make money, right? So. That financial freedom is super important, and I think the other big advice I'd give, which is not I'll try to be a little bit different from the type of startup advice that everyone gives. I think it's also about believing in your values. One thing that was very, very difficult for us, right, is we didn't start with here's a problem, a specific problem, here's a solution, and let's try to scale it. Data science for social good, we believe that, if it has such leverage in this, in the industry, it should have a lot of leverage in the social space. We didn't do much more than that. And so what that means, it was very difficult when we first started because we got people who believed in us, we got people who did not believe in us. We talked to a lot of people that didn't quite understand what we're doing. In terms of fundraising, obviously that's also very difficult when you don't know what you're doing. When I started, I was 21, 2 years out of school. Kind of a geek. I was a data scientist before. I didn't know the codes. I didn't know the language. I didn't know how to interact with the important people, quote unquote. And probably made a fool of myself about 1,000 times. And so that was really difficult because we had times where we were like, we're not making money. I convinced somehow 8 other people to also not make money. I have some idea of where I want to go. I think we're onto something, but I can't quite tell for sure yet. And either way, it will take time to prove. We don't have access to a lot of growth capital. And when I talk to people that could be helpful to us, some of them are really helpful. Some of them are completely dismissive. It's really difficult. And I guess you just have to keep pushing, and you have to just believe in what you're doing. And that's way easier to do when you don't have any debt to pay.
So that idea of inner fortitude and having some kind of vision or goal that you're reaching for and keeping that constant.
Right.
Sounds like one key. So I see we have maybe 1 or 2 questions if we want to invite others. If you have thoughts, raise your hands and we'll, Brandy can come around or we can invite you to ask a question. So a lot of the data that you've been talking about is quantitative data. There is a question about what's the role of qualitative or ethnographic studies in big data applied to social problems?
Super important. When we do our projects, one thing we didn't.
Sorry.
Go for it.
Embarrassing. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. So for us, the whole idea of product thinking is super important. I'll explain why. When we first got started, we were more on the. So we started as a fellowship model, right? So the idea there was you need more than volunteers, and you need. But we weren't quite convinced that we could recruit people full time, right? the big thing that we realized, and the reason why we moved away from this model, is that it was really hard for us to kind of close the loop and go from here the insights, here's what you should do, to here's what's happening in the field. That's how we got to think about products, right? So the idea there was that to be useful, the things that you build have to be actionable. And when you're talking about an algorithm being actionable, means that you're building a product. And when you're building a product, it means that you need to understand the product market fit. When you want to understand product market fit, it means you need to understand the market, which means you need to understand the people. And so when it comes to qualitative data, that is very, very important, because without a good understanding of the demographic you're trying to help, it's impossible for you to build a good product, because if no one uses it, it's completely pointless. So, in the case of, I was mentioning Medic Mobile, right, the work they do in collecting mobile health data. To do that, you need to understand the demographic issues in Bangladesh. You need to understand that the way that social workers, the relationship that social workers have with the population, but also with the government. You need to understand the complex interplay, for the population between the trust you have within the government, the trust you have with your community, the trust you have in your religious group, right? So all that is super important to know how you can be helpful. So that's how I think the qualitative data can be useful.
So in Bayes Impact, do you have a team describe your team a little bit? Data scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, are there folks like that on your team? Fundraisers, we have a question about where do you look for funding for your organization?
Oh, no, we don't have any fundraisers. I guess it's been me. I think everyone on our team is kind of a jack of all trades and master of like one or two. So we have a bunch of so our team's like 8 people. We have 5 engineers, counting myself, and then you have some engineers that specialize in data science. You have data scientists who specialize in engineering. You have me, who also does a bit of fundraising and the product side. You have my co-founder Eric, who's working on the business side, but also on the product. You have a designer. We have a network of advisors, anthropologists, people who understand these issues. For us, I mean, that's actually very interesting, because the skill set that we're ultimately trying to get, the whole idea of organizational change through technology, is something that's actually pretty new. I mean, there's no degree in that, right? I mean, if anything, we'll come out of citrus, but there's no training program for this, and so that's also important in light of I was saying earlier about moving away from the fellowship model, because what we realized is that we took in pretty smart people. They learned how to do organizational change over 6 months, and they left. And so for us, we're also building our own skill set.
So when you're thinking about business development, say, where are some of your prospects? I mean, you talked about the international work. Are there national nonprofit organizations, or do you work with, say, USAID or other kind of domestic organizations?
So I can't disclose too much about the negotiations that we have underway. We do have some domestic opportunities. What's actually super interesting is that the type of challenge that you have domestically tend to be very different from the types of issues that you have internationally. But domestically, for example, one thing I can say is we worked with the Veterans Affairs, helped build something called the Military Skills Translator, which helps translate the skill set that a veteran would get through military service into a set of jobs in civilian life that they might be qualified for. You have different opportunities, different challenges in the US versus the rest of the world. Mainly, there's a lot of money. There's no shortage of it. You have a more developed ecosystem with USDS, 18F, also Code for America. So you have potentially more support. It's also a very multi-layered place where you have authorities at different levels, counties, state, federal. You have a lot more players, so it's a different game. In the developing world, I think what's also interesting is that you have the opportunity to just build infrastructure from scratch, as opposed to trying to diagnose how this complex infrastructure can be, can be improved. One thing that really excites me personally, internationally, is the whole, the rise of e-governments, the rise of you look at a country like Estonia. I don't know if you're aware, but Estonia has the most advanced e-government probably on the planet. And the way they were able to build it is because after the Cold War ended and they regained their independence, they had essentially carte blanche to say, a blank slate to say here's how we want to recreate a country, right? And then when I look at the Arab Spring, you have countries that succeeded, countries that did not succeed. I think a big piece of that is building the right infrastructure. Well, today, same thing, right? A week ago, Aung San Suu Kyi wins historic elections in Myanmar. I think that's also what's really exciting, right? It's trying to take these cases where you have a situation that enables you to really rethink from the ground up how you want to build society moving forward. That's very exciting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. What are the opportunities and trade-offs in some of the new technologies? So we have new mobile devices coming out all the time, new applications. Where do you see places that would really help your work, and where are places perhaps in some of these security protections that might hinder some of the things that you're trying to do?
I don't think anything really hinders our work in terms of new technologies. The more the better, because if anything, it helps people understand that technology can be a lever for change. I mean, I think data collection is probably the biggest thing that will help our work. So I mentioned maybe mobile probably 1,000 times, not just because I think that they're doing great work, but they are representative of this trend of innovative, often mobile-based data collection systems that enable us to get data sets that we never had before. Previously, when you wanted to get data on a population, you needed to go through these complex surveys that take a lot of time and cost a lot of money, and also are not updated very often. And because of the complexity required in organizing these surveys, where you often needed to, I guess, to be a government, or you need to have some organization that kind of planned it out, right? And I think now what's super interesting is that with technology being so ubiquitous, you have data that comes from the other way around, from the bottoms up, right? You have data that's generated from more grassroots type of initiatives, and that's also super useful for us.
Yeah, I want to ask about the grassroots piece too. It occurs to me, how do you go about understanding where your blind spots are? So in a number of cases, say, women in some parts of the world might not have as much access to mobile devices, or there might be particular populations, maybe you're overrepresenting youth.
Yeah.
And how do you go about thinking about that in a maybe mathematical model, or a more kind of on-the-ground model?
That's more on the ground. That's where we go back to the question about qualitative data. That's how you can really, and your understanding of the situation will never be perfect, right? Perfect. I never know where to put the accent. But the thing that's very important is to not just, in French we have a word like solutionism, right? It's also English, but I guess people are less cynical here. But that overpowering optimism that we can solve everything with technology from above, from Silicon Valley, without needing to be on the ground. I think that can be harmful at times. There was a lot of talks, for example, with the whole Google flu trends, right? Where they didn't realize that there were biases because, one simple case is that because they did autocomplete in the flu trends, it's also kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Where the more people search for food trends, the more the food trend will go up, and the more people search for food trends. You had this case in Boston where they were trying to crowdsource pothole detection, and obviously was biased towards the neighborhoods that had more mobile-enabled people, which means all the the student towns, the places where young people live, right?
Who had the devices with the sensors that would pick up those anomalies.
And so I think there's no silver bullet to that. It's very important to be on the ground, to talk to people, to understand the demographics that go through qualitative data. There's also quantitative data that can help. the fact that it's open source also helps, because if we don't pretend to be the ones to come up with the solution, right? If we have a solution, and then there's another group that finds a blind spot and they think they can reuse some of the stuff that we built, then more power to them.
What were some of the surprises or challenges that you've come across in the last couple of years in starting your company?
I think the big one is that, as much as we like to say that with technology you can do change that's non-political, right? Like through technology, we'll connect the communities. We will empower a citizen movement that's not political. I think the main insight that I got is that it's not true. So it's I mean, it's true to some extent. Like, it's not necessarily partisan. It's not so it's not partisan. It's not a matter of like right versus left. It's not it's Democrats versus Republicans. But it is political, because the second that you're trying to change the way that communities lived, right? The second you're trying to change social programs on any kind of scale, you are entering the realm of politics. If only because the whole unemployment thing, right? Like if you can reduce the unemployment rate in a country, that's great, but that's also the kind of things that people get elected for. And so even though the solution you're proposing is more technical, is more, it's not a partisan thing in itself, you have to understand that you need to acknowledge that this is something that could be potentially political, that this is something that especially when you try to get data from these people, you do need their buy-in without also being completely subservient to them. It's it's a very complicated dance, and I think we were very naive at the beginning, where we thought that we could just be the smart people who do it. It's definitely not true. And I guess the other thing too is that going back to the idea of products, right? That means that what's very important to do is to make sure that you have some amount of independence and control over the product vision. That means that governments, for example, have their hands tied in many ways, right? They innovate in many ways. USDA is doing great work at it, but you still have to operate within the constraints. And in many ways, it's fine. In some other ways, I think the challenge is that it's hard to, when you, not just governments, right? Any organization in general, technological change is very difficult, and very often the first thing the organizations do when they undertake a technological transformation is just to think that the software is just a better version of paper. And so that's great, but then when you're trying to change the way that people operate, you kind of need the high-level buy-in, because it will have implication on the structure of the organization. And so that requires buy-in from above. So when you say buy-in from above, when it comes to governments, it often means that you need buy-in from the political class. As much as you don't want to do it, you kind of have to. So that was probably the biggest insight that we got.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I imagine that's what makes it challenging, but also really exciting and stimulating. I mean, you said your background here at UC Berkeley was in math and political science, right? That sounds like the perfect combination for the work that you're doing now. And perhaps a recommendation if there are students out there to, not just focus on the data science, but also to think about the anthropology or political science or other aspects.
Definitely. I mean, it's super fascinating. A lot of people, when I decided to move into the whole data and math space, were like, why are you doing this? With your police-sci background. There are a lot of things that we would not have expected that actually require understanding, and like some pretty good understanding of political science. So I'll give one example, right? When you talk about refugees, turns out that a critical, first off, it's obviously political. But it turns out that if you want to create a solution, for example, at the entry point where the refugees coming from, a very important geographical zone is the Balkans. So Greece, but also Serbia, Croatia, and you have to look at facts like, for example, Serbia is not part of the European Union, but it applied to the EU in 2009. And so as a result, when you go pitch the idea that Serbia is instrumental in the resolution of a problem that affects Europe in general, you are actually influencing their candidacy to the EU, right? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you would never have guessed from a purely technological standpoint.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, that's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking ahead, the vision for Bay's impact in the next 2 to 5 years, where do you see the organization going?
2 to 5, I don't know, maybe in 30 years.
You can say longer if you like, more long-term horizon.
Well, basically the idea for us is that we want to, so I use this analogy, but the idea of like a UN of technology. So what I think is super important is when I was talking about these countries that are building the infrastructure, I think there's a lot of, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to mutualize kind of like that discovery process. If Estonia figured out how to build an e-government, that's great for them. In the US, USDS took inspiration for UKDS, the British initiative. You have a lot of, I think you have a lot of commonalities between what different countries need. What's really difficult is that you can't just go into a country and give a set of recommendations because it often won't be used. Although people try, I mean, the Open Government Partnership is doing great work in this. And where I think there's an opportunity for us is to do it more on an operational side. So if we have this technology, so if I have this an employment system that I can give to France, hopefully I can also go to other countries and also give the same solution to them, right? And maybe do this for other things as well.
Great.
So that would be the idea.
I like that, the UN of technology.
Don't hold me accountable. We'll probably in 6 months.
I'll go to all your member countries and come back. So we're going to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to your remarks.
Let me think for a second. I think, yeah, I mean, kind of going back on this whole idea of just, I guess, resilience and if there's one thing that is constant, and I mean, there was constant at Bay's impact is that there was no constant. Is that we kind of had to adapt and face a bunch of hardships. We'll probably have a lot coming up, and I think the single most important thing here was resilience and knowing what you stand for. It sounds kind of cheesy, but I think kind of the risk of being too smart, like when we come in with a technological solution, is that we believe that because it's a solution, we actually don't need to take the personal risk, right? It's the solution is good, it's better, it will impose itself. It will impose itself, right? And it's not always true. I mean, in some cases it's true. In many cases, it does require you to just go back to the drawing board and really trying to figure out like why you're doing it for. And yeah, when I usually give talks, I often start with kind of the story, my story, and why I decided to do this. So the long answer is I was I grew up in a poor neighborhood in France. My parents had they were part of the Tiananmen Square protests, and obviously it didn't go too well. But the one thing that really struck me there was that a group of individuals can change something the scale of China, and if you change something the scale of China, I mean, the scale is just mind-boggling, right? Like, even the small improvement times the number of people in China, because there's a ton of them, a ton of us. That equals a really large impact. And so the idea of scale, I mean, that's kind of like how I got it from. And then obviously there was other things in my life that kind of led me to that. But when I discovered data science, that's what clicked for me, right? It's the idea that yes, politics is one way to affect things at scale, and another way is through algorithms, right? So I think it's kind of important to understand why you want to do these things. So that's like the long story. The short story is, I'm from Paris. Obviously, it's been a rough weekend, I don't know if anyone else is from Paris, but I think the worst is the feeling of powerlessness that you have. I was on the phone, on Facebook, on Twitter the whole weekend trying to figure out. I had some friends who were in the concerts, and I was trying to figure out, like if they were okay, if they are, but But yeah, that feeling of powerlessness is terrible, right? And I think the thing today is that with technology, we don't have to be powerless. We have the tools to do it. And even if we have to give up a lot of money to do it, if we could make way bigger salaries elsewhere, I just don't want to, when my grandkids ask me, like, what do you do with these tools that you had? Like, I don't want to say that that was just making people click ads. You know what I mean? So that's the one thing I would say.
Good. Well, thank you for your work, and thank you for spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you.